get this thing pumped up.
All right. Can you guys hear me well? Well, thank you everyone for coming to the IoT monetization session, also known as Show Me the Money session. My name is Abhi Rele. I, for the last almost 2 years, have led product and marketing for Samsung Arctic Cloud. For those of you who attended the keynote this morning, you heard the announcement that Samsung is unifying Arctic Cloud, Samsung Connect, and SmartThings into one unified cloud platform. So we're super excited with the direction that we are heading and the benefits that this unification will have for all our customers. I'm super stoked with the 4 panelists we have here. They are 4 senior executives from market leaders, and they have a lot to share. We just had a pre-meeting, and just going by that discussion, this promises to be a very entertaining discussion, very insightful discussion. I'll let them introduce themselves in just a minute, but I wanted to set the stage before we got into the actual discussion. And to set the stage around IoT monetization, I wanted to take you back to the dot-com boom. If you remember, in the 2000s, there was unbridled optimism about what technology could do, how technology would change the landscape that we were in. You had a number of companies launching technology products. Everybody was rushing in on the action. People called it the new gold rush. But not all these companies succeeded. Many of them failed. It wasn't because of lack of good ideas. If you think about Webvan, and now we order groceries and food all the time. It was really about a lack of business models. People started chasing eyeballs, and they forgot about profits. And that's what undid them. You look at IoT today, and you see companies launching really cool connected products. Some useful, some you could look at them and question their use. And we are at a very similar stage. You can't help but draw a parallel with the dot-com boom, because you're having these connected products doing cool things. But now that we start talking to companies, and in my role, I talk to many companies, the conversation is starting to shift. In just a couple months back, we launched our own Arctic monetization solution. And in the context of that, the conversations we've started to have with companies are something like this. Companies talk to us about the connected product that they've launched. They typically charge for the product when it is sold at the time of initial sale. But then they need to support this connected product for the life of that product, which could be 5 years or more. And what companies are starting to ask us now is, how do I make money from IoT? This model isn't sustainable. How do I become profitable in IoT? And is it time for new business models for IoT? And that's exactly what we're here to talk about. So for the next 40 minutes or so, we'll talk about business model issues in IoT. We'll talk about strategies and tactics that companies have adopted, and you'll hear a lot of good insights here. And we'll leave you with a few actionable insights, a few actionable takeaways that hopefully you can implement in your own IoT programs. A bit of logistics, each of you should be seeing a flashcard, an Arctic flashcard. So if you have questions, write it on that. We have some folks who will bring these up here. We'll include those questions in the discussion because we want to make sure we get all your questions answered. At the end, we'll open up the mic and give you a chance to ask questions live as well. So if we don't get any of your questions answered through the flashcard, feel free to walk up and ask questions at the end. So with that, let's get started. So what I'd like to do is ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves. Tell us your name, your company, your role within the company, and then also tell us the role your company plays in the world of IoT. So Naveen, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Naveen Sastry with McKinsey. I'm a partner there. I've been co-leading our IoT practice for the last 5 years. But it started actually when I was at Berkeley 18 years ago, 17 years ago, working with DARPA, and IoT was on the horizon. And so that was always 3 years away. I think the technology's there. It's still, for a long time, it was 3 years away. I think we're finally there. And now the question is the business model here, or is it 3 years away, and how long is that 3 years going to last? So,
Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome.
My name is Khvostionov, and I'm Vice President of Software Platforms and Architecture for Acuity Brands. And so the company, we like to think that where there's people, there's lights. Where there's lights, there's power, right? And we're capitalizing on that effect, and we're putting compute at the fixtures. And we're one of the largest lighting manufacturers in the world. That means we have a lot of square footage. That means we can also provide a lot of connectivity for a very large sensor density. We're converting our smart fixtures into mesh network fixtures, so we're able to marshal data all the way from the edge to the fog, and then also to the cloud. Thank you.
Welcome, Dennis. Manny?
So I'm Manny Linhares. I work for Legrand, specifically out of North America. Legrand is a very diverse company. Here in North America, we focus on transforming spaces, specifically through power, data, and light. Very diverse, as I said, all the way from electrical wiring systems through commercial AV solutions, data center, both infrastructure as well as power. Also some lighting sectors as well, lighting fixture manufacturing. And I think I'm potentially missing some of them as well, but nonetheless, very diverse. Where do we play specifically in IoT is we firmly believe that open and interoperable solutions are what the market needs to keep progressing and moving forward. So in many of the solutions we build, we have that as our first and foremost position in the types of solutions we build. Thank you.
Welcome. David.
Hi, I'm David Miller at Mattel, a learning, development, and play company. I'm the Vice President of Product Management for a group called Advanced Concepts. And think of it as a smallish skunkworks group where we tinker with emerging technologies and we bring fun play patterns to kids and families.
Welcome. So thank you, all of you. Let me start with our first question. We recently had the Samsung CEO Summit, and for those of you who attended, we talked about data being the new oil. But when you think about connected products and data, they're really a chicken and egg problem. Without a connected product, there is no data. And unless you find a use for that data, the connected product won't last for too long. So let me start by asking you guys, how do you start thinking about this problem? Does the data come first, or does the connected problem come first? Manny, why don't we start with you?
You bet. So I love that. I love that topic because as a business who looks forward to coming up with new experiences for all the different markets we serve, we're constantly up against that question of do we build a connected device and come back and start collecting the data? And I'm a big advocate that says, especially seeing that this session is about monetizing IoT, is that without the data, we can't come up with new experiences and new ways to leverage these devices. So it's just imperative that we think about them together, but more importantly, start collecting data right away. There's just no way we toss around the word IoT too lightly, I firmly believe. And why I say that is it really has a future promise, and that promise is only opened and sort of enlightened with data. So it's essential to make it the top priority.
What about you, Dennis? How does Acuity look at this?
So from our point of view, I don't think there's a question whether the data is valuable, right? I think a lot of us here are lifetime learners, as well as I believe enterprises are the same. So we need to learn from our products. We need to learn how our products are being utilized. And based on this information, we are able to create value-added services. Now, of course, we have use cases and business cases that support the development of the products for the short term. But again, I don't think anybody really knows what's going to happen in the future, right? And a lot of the use cases that we see in the marketplace is not just taking IoT data by itself, because data out of context only gives you a one-dimensional view of what's happening, but it's to utilize IoT data to enrich other data. For example, utilizing IoT real-time data to enrich point-of-sale data that's coming out from ERP systems, et cetera.
Cool. David, what about you? How do you think about this problem?
So I'm taking a step back. I'm going to put my product management hat on. And for me, I think everything that a corporation does, there needs to be a business goal behind it. So I'm the type of person who says, okay, what's the business goal? What's the business impact? What are the KPIs we're trying to affect? It could be revenue, which is which is fine. Revenue is a lagging indicator of success, but it is still a KPI. So start with the business goal that you're trying to affect, work your way backwards from that, and construct, okay, well, what's the technology that I need to build in order to affect that business impact or create that business impact. Otherwise, you're building tech for tech's sake, and you're building a solution that's looking for a problem.
So, Naveen, you have the benefit of working with a wide variety of customers. McKinsey also published the seminal report on IoT and how it's a $11.1 trillion opportunity. How do you see companies addressing this? Do you see any patterns when you work with customers?
I think there's a lot of data that's out there that's untapped. And so, I mean, just the example that comes to mind is an oil rig. So if you think about an offshore oil rig today, there's about 40,000 points of instrumentation there. But the number that actually make it get stored, get logged, put offline or into a database onshore, analyzed, and come back into a decision is basically zero. So this is a question of actually not new devices in this particular case, but it's of actually using the data that's already being collected on some specific machine. You can go to any factory. You talk to the guys there, they'll say, PLM, and this is not new for us. We've got data all over, but we don't actually use it. And so I think there's partly a question of there's lots of latent data that can be used, whether it's stuck because of connectivity or because people don't know how to tap it or they don't have the data models. All of those are true. And there's a second question, which is when we're going to go build out a new space or we're going to use a new factory or a new something, how do we actually wire it and set it up and create the business systems that actually take the data and set up the processes so that people can use the data? And so I think there's two fronts, but obviously the install base is just so much larger than what's going in new. We got to fix that problem first, or in parallel, and that's a huge opportunity. And then much less new products, but the new products is just it's a 2 or 3 year cycle time before we get even one new product that's if you decide to make a decision today. So I think that there's a balance, but let's also remember that there's lots out there that we're not using.
So it sounds like you all agree that understanding what you want to do with the data, how it will help your business is key. But Naveen, what you're saying is in some cases you just may not have easy access to that data. So thinking about what data you need and what data you will actually get hold of is a key point to keep in mind.
Yeah, if I could jump in.
Absolutely.
I think that what's really important is with this chicken or egg question, specifically with some of the solutions that we're all trying to manufacture, it's obvious data is important, but what we know today with the data, whether we collect it or not, because some of us aren't collecting anything today, but to leverage the data, you may not actually know all the wonderful things you can do with it, right? Like one of the best cases of data sort of payback that's untapped is using the data you have to create better devices for Rev 2 or Rev Next, however you say that. Well, that alone is amazing, right? But the question is does that give you a revenue stream to support? So there's many ways to price your products, price your solutions where initially you could have this device cost me X, but there's some cost associated with collecting data for X number of years after that. Well, if you tack that on to the original cost of the product, you may outprice yourself. So there's ways to think about how do you actually recur that gap, and some of those ways may not be obvious, like in the sense of being able to have a ton of data. Well, you're already ahead of the game because you can start looking at the data, maybe make Rev Next better or better use case. But I think some of the other amazing pieces are watching the data for a while and actually figuring out new use cases that you can go back to your customers with and potentially claim back some of the costs that you've spent by unlocking a new feature for them that you didn't even know you had until you actually had a chance to look at the data.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I don't think in this day and age, I don't think we can really talk about data without mentioning the machine learning revolution that's happening all around us, right? neural networks, deep learning, right? This is all terminology that I'm sure everybody has heard. In essence, what it's doing is it's creating models to predict outcomes, right? To have some sort of maybe leading indicators into many malfunctions that may happen. But to your point on oil wells, and we also have quite a bit of experience with this as well, because a lot of times we may think that the pipe to the cloud is unlimited. In fact, it's actually very limited. The amount of data that industrial IoT produces, it's not feasible to pump it all to the cloud, right? And what I really believe is that an aspect of deep learning and machine learning that we can capitalize on is the fact that today it's currently utilized for identifying meaningful data and building prediction models around that. But it's actually throwing away all the noise, right? So as a side effect of these deep learning models is also a model for how to identify the noise, right? And if we're doing this on the edge, we can identify that noise and we can skip sending the noise to the cloud, right? So it's kind of a two-way aspect about looking at data from that point of view.
That brings us to an interesting question about what kinds of use cases should you start working on? And there are internal use cases where you're optimizing your operations, and there are customer-facing use cases where you're delivering connected experiences for people and for your customers. How do you evaluate those two scenarios in the context of data, as we are talking about? And Naveen, how do you guys look at it? I'm sure you get called on by a lot of customers asking exactly that question: where do we start?
Yeah, so and maybe I'm colored from my B2B lens, but people are really excited by top line growth. So new products that come and have IoT connected, whatever. It's hard because the product life cycle time, the product development time, and then you have to train your sales force. There's oftentimes sales force incentive issues, which is, hey, I know how to sell a piece of equipment or a piece of pipe or a regular thing, a turbine. But now I have to sell some software on top that connects it and uses the data. And it's just really hard to get the incentives for that sales force to use it right. Mm-hmm. I've seen just like, there's so many low-hanging fruit internal use cases that are productivity driven, can help the field force get intelligence on the asset they're going to, or that can help product teams learn about what's actually failure that's happening. Mm-hmm. That ultimately, when kind of, as much as people really like the new top line products and services, what ends up being easier to push through an organization's internal boundaries and adopt is the internal use cases that drive bottom line productivity in the short term. It also lets you try it in a safe environment. If something goes wrong, you still have your old manual processes or your old way of doing things that fall back on. And so you're not putting at risk, customer success or something, or your reputation. You've kind of got a bit of a firewall. And then as you gain confidence, figure out what your technology is, figure out what the wrinkles are, then you can actually think about how do you productize that or turn that into a business model. So as an example, if you've got a field force that's going to service a piece of equipment in the field, well, getting the intelligence off it so that the person who's going to go visit it has the intelligence, hey, the failure is likely to be failure A and failure B is the second one. Put those parts on the truck. If you're wrong, you still, worst case, you've got A and B and you've done what you did before. And so if you can get it right and prove it to yourself, then you can actually change that business model from a time and materials business model to a ongoing recurring revenue stream that says we'll keep it as a service up. And so I think that's the business model transition that you can make without having to go and sell it right away. And so, and again, I think this applies much more in the B2B context than B2C, where it's, I guess I don't have that same experience. I'd love to hear from some.
I'd love to hear what, Legrand, Acuity, Mattel, how do you guys look at it?
Let me say something about my days at Yahoo. Naveen, you're completely right about internal programs being easier to sell and implement, and we call that eating your own dog food. And above and beyond the fact that it's lower risk, it's easier to get to a yes. It also helps you harden the platform that you're going to be using for your future customer-facing products. So, agreed with your perspective there.
So, from my perspective, and being so diversified in products and solutions, it's really hard to give one example, but I'll just share quick two. So we and this is a global sort of perspective. Is one of our businesses overseas thought they created the most amazing scene, this automated scene for one of their products, and they called the scene Away, and what they did is they put it on the second swipe of their app, and everyone's curious about how that scene was used, and they found out that it was rarely ever used, like not at all, and all of our businesses are here to make money, so why would you support a feature in this solution to do that? So they found out that everybody was using the app but never would leave the front page. So they said, before we scrap this really cool feature called Away, let's just move it to the front and let's just call it what it is, which is all off. Like very, very simple. They just moved it to the front page. All of a sudden, it was the #1 most used feature in the app. And in Europe, there's a commonality to just shut your house down. One button, your whole house shuts off as you leave. So lights, outlets, everything's shutting off. And it became the #1 most used. So did that help us externally or internally? It's really hard to put a weight on that because it helped us internally because we saw that a major flaw in where we placed this coolest feature ever, right, on the second page of an app versus moving it to where it belongs, which is that front page of the app. So that that's huge, and that sort of gives you those both scenarios of how it can help you both internally and externally.
Absolutely. So let's move to a topic that is pretty core to this business model issue, which is a connected product. Every product has a BOM cost, a bill of material cost. And as you bring connected services onto this product, you're now adding a recurring cost over the life of the product. And some customers look at the effective BOM cost and say, my BOM cost has gone up by a few dollars in some cases, some places even more. And when companies are very sensitive to variations in a few pennies on their BOM cost, when you're increasing it by a few dollars, that's a huge variance. And that we find is a core issue with business model in IoT. So I'd love to hear your thoughts, and I'll just open this up to all of you. How do you guys look at this issue of how do you look at the recurring cloud costs relative to the BOM cost model that you've been so familiar with?
From our point of view, it's very important to, of course, to keep this in mind. All right, let's just imagine that we're all extremely successful and we hit those targets that I think everybody's aware of in terms of the value of IoT in the market. And with that, of course, comes huge cloud hosting bills, right? Now, again, there's some things that you have to do in the cloud, right? But there's also some things that you can do on the fog, on the edge, which is basically on-premise, right? So you need to have hybrid solutions. You need to do edge compute. Right, you need to have capabilities, right, and compute power embedded throughout the space in such a way that you can offload some of those calculations, right? And I think that really helps to curtail the costs, the ballooning costs of the cloud.
I have to absolutely agree. That's if you're going to try to manage your costs, the best way to do that is manage how much cloud services you need to buy or pay for, and at the same time, it's the more scrutinization of the data before it ends up in the cloud that you can do localized. Obviously, there's tremendous benefits. Plus, what happened? Thinking of the residential spectrum for a minute. What happens if the cloud isn't there? Right, all those wonderful things you want to actually happen in that promise of what IoT brings you goes away, right? So a bit of that needs to stay locally, or at least with the ability to take some of those features locally. So I agree that's one way. The other point to make is that it's really important to make a good choice on how you figure out that cost that's unknown yet, right? In a company like ours who's moving into trying to digitize our entire portfolio, the BOM cost is not moving by pennies or dollars. It's doubling or tripling because it went from a typical wiring device to something that's completely connected and capable of doing much more than it used to. So just looking at that BOM cost alone is a lot to take in.
Naveen, do you see any differences between when you look at industrial markets and enterprise markets where you have retrofits and you have aftermarket considerations? Do you see this cost issue being looked at differently by like oil and gas companies, for example?
Yeah, I think there's two things. I think the BOM cost sensitivity is there. I mean, if you just think of jet engines, they can absorb about $100 or $1,000 BOM cost, and so you're seeing the price of the device to where it's just in the noise coming down over time. So I think $1 million device, add $1,000 to BOM, $500, yeah, you can make it work. I think you're probably at that point where under 5 or 10,000, it's in the noise. But then what happens below that? Then that's where I think Manny's saying where we got to watch every dollar on it, and it's not so clear that it's free. I'm optimistic that just as the Moore's Law tech curve comes down, that in 10 years we'll be saying, yeah, it doesn't matter. It's we're at the $5 or $10 price point of the end device. I think there's also a good question around. Can you get the value out of it? And that's the second piece, which is, I just worry that you're going to be paying cloud hosting fees in 5 years for data that no one actually ever will use on a device that's no longer being updated. Mm-hmm. And so you're stuck with this latent cost. But then you flip it around and say, what does Tesla do? They put that, they're paying a ton of that cost both for streaming, and they made it work because they're putting new features that delight. So I think that if you're creative enough, I think you can actually probably make it work, but you got to put the railroad tracks ahead of time. And I like this point about putting as much local computation there and using the cloud selectively where it makes sense.
Well, also, at the end of the day, if we look at IoT, right? IoT itself, right? It's an enabling technology, right? There's very few use cases where you can monetize IoT, if you will, directly, right? There has to be business value from it, right? And again, that business value that you ultimately get from the solution has to be more than the hosting cost, right? That has to be more than the BOM difference of the actual components. Again, for us, we manufacture lighting fixtures, right? So, it's a utility that most people take for granted. However, the use cases that are enabled by it, right, and the BOM costs that we have to absorb because we have to be very competitive in the market, the use cases that are enabled by it are many times dictated by our customers, right? Our customers are also our partners. Mm-hmm. Our partners will lead us to finding the business value around how they will be able to utilize this infrastructure that we are providing to them.
Great point. So a related topic here is charge for the device or charge for the service. And that's, again, a hot topic. Should you lease or give away the product for free and then just monetize the data usage? Or do you somehow try to figure out what your cost structure might look like and then bake that into the initial price? How do you guys think about that? Again, let me open this up to all of you. How do you guys think about, should I charge for the device or charge for the service?
I think that there's a double-edged sword there, and I think the biggest one is death by 1,000 cuts is still death, right? So there's a point, like there's competitors, there's companies out there that are charging $1. So it seems negligible, and then a new feature comes out. Well, you got to add it for another $1, and then you got to add it for another $1, and then who knows what you're paying at the end of that service. Plus, you're buying other ecosystem services. So there's so many $1 services that just thank goodness your PayPal account doesn't have to pay service fees for all the different $1 bills you send out. So I think that you have to be cautious about both ways, and I think. You both nailed it in your description of like it has to be a service that has a value more than what you're paying for, right? So I will absolutely go back every single time when this question is brought to me, is saying it's about the use case. If whatever that wonderful IoT feature brings you is a value in that use case big enough, then there's a way to charge for a service.
Do you guys see any patterns around types of use cases where giving the product away for free makes more sense, and use cases where not doing that makes more sense. Any of you can take a shot.
Yeah, I'll say that picking a specific product that I have in mind per se, and we've had a conversation many times today about this topic. But if you just take like light switches, for example, in the residential space, and this goes back to your previous question of industrial. When somebody brings up, well, is residential just growing slower than industrial? Well, probably not. Industrial's just been doing this for such a long time that it's new to this space. And then the other problem with our space, residential thinking again for a minute, is that we all want to just test it out like one at a time. So if you're thinking about light switches, companies who build light switches can't sell one at a time. They need to think about selling more than one. So as we as consumers dip our toe in to sort of test that one at a time, it's actually not, it doesn't, like the business behind building those isn't selling massive numbers, right? So there's a piece of that lags behind. And as consumers, we wait, we wait for an Amazon Echo to be released before we say, hey, I don't want it to just play music anymore. I want to see if I can turn a light on and off. I want my thermostat to lower down. So until these new use cases start popping up, will it actually cause that rippling effect? So for most of us as manufacturers of products, there isn't a chance to give it away yet because the use case that's substantial enough to offer a service isn't blatantly in front of us yet.
I think that's right. I mean, just looking at kind of a new product introduction, the promise of the value is there, but until people actually believe it, and if you are not willing to underwrite a contract that puts money at risk, it's kind of hard to actually say, hey, we're gonna charge you for the value, because we all know that value-based pricing is what you should be doing, but when the value is nebulous or not yet proven, or you're the first reference case, how do you do it? And that applies, I think, equally in the business side as well as on the consumer side. And so I just see it's going to happen where we're going to start charging per device, just like kind of how we're used to buying stuff. And as that value becomes more and more clear, then you can make that pricing model shift, and also business model shift where you've actually got the data to say, actually, the economics support it, the value supports it, we're willing to enter into a long-term contract, we've got ways to measure the value, and then shift to then pricing by for the outcome or for the service, and then quote unquote give away the product. But I just imagine if any of you guys were around from, I guess, 2001 or the QCat, you remember that? That was a little gizmo they gave away, which was a barcode reader effectively that was connected. They gave it away, and everyone took it on Slashdot and had lots of them. And I don't know what they did with them, but they were going to make it up in ads and all this and that. But I just worry that until you've actually proven the value, you're going to be giving away QCats by the truckload.
So while we're talking about charge, sorry, did you have a point?
I just wanted to mention the IoT industry currently is immature, right? The true business value, the unicorns of monetizing it, right? Not all of them have been created yet, right? So that's definitely in the future, and then definitely as manufacturers, we have to have skin in the game. And we need to think about this future, right? And we need to be farsighted enough to potentially even provide functionality to customers that maybe right now it's not at an additional cost. However, the customer chooses to enable it, right? Because that creates some sort of business value for them. That's when they might be more adept to actually paying for it.
So let's do one more question before we open up to audience questions. So if you guys are following the news, Chamberlain, the garage opener, recently decided to charge $1 a month for their IFTTT applets, or $10 a year. You can see it from their side. They need to recoup some of their data costs. But on the other side, if you look at responses from end users, not everybody's happy. So it's a very difficult problem because you want to recoup some of these costs, but at the same time, you don't want to alienate your core customer base. And yet, each company has to deal with this issue at some point in their life. So how would you guys think about this problem? David, why don't we start with you?
So I like this question. It's a good example. I am a Chamberlain user, but we don't have a Chamberlain IoT system. But I mean, this is a very classic issue of what, when you give something away for free, what happens when you charge for it? And so for the same reason, I mean, it's a very painful problem. And for the same reason that we're all here at this conference, I mean, the internet has given customers a very loud voice. And I think that's a good thing, because what that does is it allows customers to hold companies responsible for doing right by the customer and being super thoughtful ahead of time about the products that they're launching and the business models that they're launching and so on and so forth. So, I mean, unfortunately, this is probably a difficult situation where I think that one question Chamberlain would have to ask itself is, okay, how sticky is my product, right? Because if there is a customer pain and switching costs are low, that's dangerous, and that can turn into customer attrition. Another thing that they could experiment with is, and they could do this through some testing or some regional testing, would be like first-party market research, and or trying to do some sort of grandfathering and or experimenting with some sort of freemium where, okay, well, maybe there's like a few of those features that are free, but for these additional features that of course add all this value that hopefully they do, you can charge for them. So yeah, I think experimenting could be a way to figure their way out of this.
So, any of you wrestled with the same issue?
Well, I'm thankful my connected garage door openers are not Chamberlain, but I think that for all of us, it's an amazing use case to watch what's going to happen, because it's quite daring to do that, right? That's that death by 1,000 cuts that I mentioned earlier, and it's sort of watch what the reaction is. The public reaction isn't completely positive. In fact, it's not good at all. So I'm eagerly watching this, and for my business, it's very important for me to keep an eye on how this actually runs its course.
From my point of view, connectivity should be democratized, right? I don't think you should charge for connectivity. And I think this question is specifically from a B2C perspective. In the B2B world, we are constantly connecting different manufacturers, different systems, different protocols. And a little history about myself, I joined Acuity about 1.5 years ago from a company called DigiLogic, where we created an open source IoT platform that was completely free and open source. And by creating by getting rid of this barrier where you no longer have to pay for connectivity to various devices and various protocols, we're actually seeing the customers become very happy about that.
Cool. So I didn't see anybody writing questions on the flashcards. We have about 7 minutes to go. So why don't we open up the mics? And if anyone has a question, please come forward. Otherwise, we have a few more questions we can ask. There's a mic right here. So if you could introduce yourself, that would be great.
Hi, my name is Suresh Subramaniam. I work for a company called Wiz Systems. My question is to do with the data. Who owns it? When you have a number of players providing different services, there's always some friction around who owns the data, and that usually destroys one or all of them. So what are your thoughts?
So I'll take that one to start. So we internally in Legrand, we have a program called Elliot that focuses both our internal and external thoughts around IoT. And in this program specifically, we leave that decision up to the customer. So we believe that as they generate the data is theirs. Believe me, we ask for it. But the point is we believe it's their choice to share it or not. Now obviously we talked about use cases and user experiences. That does not happen unless they share that information. So they have to understand that without sharing, you have an app that turns something on or off. But to open up those use cases, we need to access some of that data, and we absolutely anonymize any piece of data that we use the minute we can.
I echo Manny 100%. That's absolutely true. And I think it's, I think the term is called data sovereignty, right? And I think it's very important when the customer does choose to say, okay, well, you can utilize my data. It's also, what happens downstream of this is, again, this data gets enriched, different sources of data come together to, again, maybe affect some sort of a business outcome. But you have to know where all of this data is originating from, right? You need to track it, and your platform needs to be built in such a way that you can always trace it back.
Anything else?
Oh, I'm going to make maybe a crazy prediction here, which is I think the data and the API are basically two sides of the same issue. Mm-hmm. And I think we may see just like a consumer bill of rights, just like a data and API bill of rights. So if that's my speaker, that's my data, and the sound that comes out of it, those are mine. And I think we're already starting to see that coming out of some of the industrial equipment manufacturers. They're trying to say that, hey, the sensing data that's coming off of a tractor, we own that. We've got the camera, we put the camera there, and we're going to own it and start charging for APIs and access to it. Farmers don't like that. And I think you're hearing it from a garage door perspective. You don't like that. It doesn't feel fair. And I think we're in this in-between phase, this teenager phase, where we're kind of figuring these rules out. My prediction is I think the consumers are going to win on this one, both industrial and consumption. And of course, there'll be some exceptions, but I'm seeing RFP tenders going out saying, hey, we're only going to buy your stuff if, and I think people will say the same thing as a consumer. I'm only going to buy this thing, I'll pay $10 more if it's mine. And the ones that they're not, just not going to get purchased. So, of course, there's going to be exceptions, I think. But
so we have one last question.
So for those of you who've used Arctic Cloud, Samsung products, we've also been very clear about the user owning the data because that is the cleanest model. You own it, you decide what you want to do with it. It actually helps downstream because if somebody else wants access to it, the person owning the data can make the decision. And as long as it's between them, a lot of things get simplified. But great question. Please introduce yourself.
Yes. So my name is Andrew, and I work for a kids mobile gaming company. My question is specifically David Miller. I'm just curious on your perspective on how IoT impacts the toy industry. It seems it's hard for at least folks like us to imagine how the two might come together. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a good question. So first of all, for a company that builds experiences for kids and families, I think upstream in all of our thinking, we have to have privacy, COPA, and data security embedded. And it's a cultural thing. And so I have a mechanical engineering background, and so one thing that we used to learn was design for manufacturing, so DFM, right? So when you're designing something, think about the downstream manufacturing implications. So culturally, we think about design for privacy, design for data security, design for COPA, et cetera. So now, those are table stakes. Now, when you've done that, there are still really great experiences that can be brought to kids and families, right? For learning, development, and play, and things of that sort. Yeah, you have to be conscious of those things that I just talked about, but there's still more to learn and more to come on what great experiences. A great example is we just launched an IoT product called Kamagami. So Kamagami is a buildable, foldable robot, and you can build, you can program it, and you can play with it. Everything's there's no registration, everything's anonymous, but still, it's a great, fun STEM toy. It's I would call it a connected product, and we just launched it. So that's a good example of being able to provide great experiences and whatnot, but still being super conscious and careful of the things I just talked about earlier.
So we're almost out of time. So if I could have maybe each of you give the audience one key takeaway that they can help implement their monetization plan around their IoT products. what would be that one takeaway? Maybe we'll start with you, David.
Yeah, I want to emphasize the point I just made. So if the session was about business models and monetization of IoT, same thing. Design for monetization. So it's not an afterthought. Don't build something and then say, okay, great, now how are we going to monetize it? Design for monetization upfront, upstream. That's my takeaway for you guys.
Thank you.
Manny? So my takeaway would be that the true promise of IoT is to make sure that the interconnections between different types of devices have the ability to share data with one another and impact how the other devices are being used. So stay open, stay interoperable, and make sure that the true promise of IoT can actually be achieved by creating a large ecosystem of connected devices.
Use your customers as your partners, right? At the end of the day, they are going to be very welcome to experimenting, right? Build in operational telemetry into your products so you can see what's going on. It's like A/B testing in the web world, right? The same thing is applicable to IoT. It's very important to prove your thoughts of this business case or business value. So do POCs with your customers. They're going to teach you a lot.
Mm-hmm. I think similar to that, I think we're in the teenage years. It's awkward, it's messy, it's ugly, but the future is bright. And so what does that mean? You try a lot of things, you skin your knees, you kind of look goofy, but hopefully you're quick enough on your feet to learn. Because I don't think any of us know what's going on right now, and it's a good time to just get out there and put yourself out there.
That's a great way to end the session. Teenage years, I think I love that analogy. Well, thank you all for coming out here. I hope all of you enjoyed the session. This was very insightful discussion. We'll be around for a few more minutes, and then the Samsung celebration will start. So hopefully you get yourself some nice food, and it'll be a good evening. Thank you all for coming.